We are going to look at the text of Matthew chapter 18 verses 26. Matthew chapter 18 verses 26. Matthew chapter 9 verses 18 to 26. I beg your pardon. Matthew chapter 9 verses 18 to 26. I could see Brother Paulo look at me in horror for a moment. Thank you, Paulo. I realized something was wrong. Okay, chapter 9. So remember, by now you should say it in your sleep, okay? All those who are regularly attending this Mass. Matthew's Gospel is the teaching Gospel. 5 great discourses. We finished the first one, chapter 5, 6, 7. Sundays, we've even finished the second one, chapter 10, the mission discourse. 5, 6, 7, Sermon on the Mount. We are now in chapters 8 and 9. And we look at them together because I told you that chapter 8 and 9 have 10 miracle stories. And punctuating these miracle stories are 3 teachings, or if you like, calls to discipleship. What really is a disciple? So we are now looking at chapter 9, and we are in verse 18, and there are 2 miracle stories rolled up in one. Now, this gospel is also found in the Gospel of Mark, so if you ever have time, and if you look at the title just above, you will see that there are references. It's Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43, and it's also found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, 40 to 56. I told you that every section has a title. These titles were later additions, always remember that. And below that title, you'll have references in case you want to find out where. Clearly, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have this, which means it must have been a very significant moment in the life of Jesus. Now, if you only look at Matthew's Gospel today, the entire episode is very sketchy. Remember, I told you this, Matthew is a teaching gospel. He wants to come to the point. Mark and Luke are far more expressive in their writing. They will give you a lot of details, especially Mark, even though the gospel is so brief. So if you want to really see the entire narrative, you have to put Matthew, Mark, and Luke together. And I'm going to do that for you so that you can see what this narrative really reveals. There are lots of interesting details. What do we know when we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke together, the synoptics together, when we are looking at this incident? First, we know the synagogue official's name. His name is Jairus. We know that he has a daughter who is 12 years old. And finally, Jesus raises her. She's dead and she is raised. What else do we know? We know that there was a woman suffering from a bleeding or a hemorrhage for 12 years, and she touches the fringe of Jesus' cloak, and she's cured. So now we know the names, we know the ages, we know the people involved. Very interestingly, my dear sisters and brothers, there are other Gospels that also tell us information. Now you'll say, Father, there are 4 Gospels, where are the others coming from? These are called Apocryphal Gospels. So remember when that famous, or rather that I call it the infamous book, but a great storyline, Da Vinci Code came out. Dan Brown spoke of Apocryphal Gospels, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and today I'm going to talk about the Gospel of Nicodemus, or the what we call the Acts of Pilate. So there are the 4 canonical Gospels, which the Council of Trent has given us, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Canonical because they have been measured and they're found to be worthy of scripture study and worship. And then you have Apocryphal Gospels. So don't get panicky when people say to you, oh, but there were other Gospels also. Yes, there were other writings also in the New Testament, at the time of the New Testament was compiled, but the church decided not to take it. Okay? Let me give you a simple example. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, there's a story of Jesus going to his mother sending him to go to the well, and he goes to the well, and there I think he was up to a little bit of mischief, and he dropped the pot, and so he comes home with water in his cloak. Okay, yeah? Sounds very nice. Is it really a miracle that we want to focus on? So, looking at the other Gospels, the Apocryphal or the Deuterocanonical books, we can also learn a little bit about this story. What do we learn? There is a Gospel called the Gospel of Nicodemus, an Apocryphal Gospel, which is also called the Acts of Pilate. And in that, we here learn the name of this woman who was bleeding, who had a hemorrhage, and according to that, her name was Bernice. There is also the great Eusebius of Caesarea, who was a Greek historian of Christianity. He was a great exegete and a polemist. And he tells us that this woman is a Gentile woman from Caesarea Philippi. So we know now lots of details. We know her name, we know where she came from, we know that she was bleeding for 12 years. Luke's Gospel tells us that no doctor could cure her. Multiple sources giving us the complete picture. Now, interestingly, the girl is 12 years old and the woman is bleeding for 12 years old. Is there some magic to the number 12? I believe if we believe that there is magic to 12, then we have to believe also that there is a curse to the number 13. Remember, 13 is okay. Whatever it is worth, people believe it is unlucky. For the same reason why 7 for the Jews was a perfect number. For lots of reasons. But anyway. But interestingly, Jairus was blessed with his daughter for 12 years of life. And the woman was cursed literally with a bleeding for 12 years of her life. So rather than look for solace in numbers, Jairus and the woman choose to find solace in Jesus. They go to the right source. And I want to make this point because very often, my dear sisters and brothers, we find solace in everything around the Lord, and when nothing works, we come to the Lord. This is a fact. Yeah, argue this as much. There are some, of course, who always go straight to Jesus. But by and large, we find solace in other things and other people. And look at these two examples. Both of them go straight to Jesus. They know where they are going to find comfort and help. Now, interestingly, Jesus interacts with a dead girl. And the healing of the woman also would have rendered Jesus ritually unclean. Let me explain this. You see, to a menstrual woman, a woman who was menstruating, was considered unclean by Jewish law. You will now understand why women never left the house for the first 40 days. Even after they gave birth, they were considered unclean. And you will now understand why that for all eternity, thank God it is gone, we never had baptisms for the first 40 days. Some also link it to the presentation, but leave it aside. All this now we know is tradition that even the church has left behind, and I'm so glad about it. But ritually, Jesus would have been unclean if he touched a dead person. He would have been unclean if an unclean person touched him. This was Jewish law. Okay? This is not something that we follow today. It was Jewish law. So a pious Jew would think twice before being touched by anybody, or even worse, touching anybody. So let me give an example of this. If you go to the parable of the Good Samaritan, the story, what do you hear? You hear of a man who is traveling between Jerusalem and Jericho. He's met with bandits, they beat him, and they leave him for dead. I like that line. He's left for almost dead. And we are told that a priest and a Levite, good people, religious people, honest people, look at him and they walk past. And all of us have made judgments. Yeah, we've said, what terrible priests, what terrible Levites. Some must have said, even our priests are like this. So all kinds of judgments are made without understanding the context of the Jewish belief. Where were these two people going? They were going to Jerusalem. If they touched that man, see in their mind what they're thinking. If they touched him, they would become unclean. Then they would have to go to Jerusalem and start performing all the rites to be ritually clean. So as heartless as that parable may make them sound, really they were tremendously afraid of being ritually unclean. Now, sadly, of course, sensitivity is lost to ceremonials. This is something that we have to look at ourselves. Think about it, and think about it very seriously. If you were heading for Sunday Mass and somebody told you, Baba, I'm very sick, can you please go down and buy medicines, and that would make you late for Mass by 15 minutes, would you go? Or would you say, I'm going to Mass and on my way back I'll bring it? It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Do ceremonials come before sensitivity? So they were afraid. So don't judge people quickly. Don't judge stories in the gospel too quickly. Don't ever say, oh, if I was there at the trial of Jesus, or if I was there, I would have done that. I think we do just the opposite. We do exactly what they do, but we tend to judge. Now, this Jewish law also, my dear sisters and brothers, of ritual impurity, therefore, socially separated a lot of people. And it should have united faith. The law of Moses should have united. It was meant to unite. It actually divided them. And a good case in point is the miracle, or this healing of this Gentile woman who comes to Jesus. Why? Because she is perpetually menstruating. She is isolated from others. Technically, she should have not even been like that leper we heard a few days ago, should have not even been in the crowd because she was impure. She should have not left her house. And to compound matters, this poor woman is suffering. The Gospel of Luke also tells us that she could not be healed by anyone. She had gone to several doctors. Perhaps all of them had cheated her. Nobody could have cured her. And the Gospel of Luke tells us she has no more money. What does she do? She cannot bear this social isolation anymore. It has stripped her of her dignity. And she says, I have to go to Jesus. Now, interestingly, Jesus does not merely heal her. He restores her dignity. Because now, as a woman, somebody who at the time of Jewish society would have been alienated, even worse, she's bleeding, alienated even more, socially unfit. Now Jesus gives her her dignity back. But look at the sensitivity of this woman, and this is what I love. She's such a sensitive woman. She knows that he's a rabbi. She knows he's a Jewish rabbi. She understands the law of the Jews, even though we are told she was a Gentile woman. She could have gone and touched him, and then he becomes ritually unclean. What does she do? The Gospels tell us so beautifully that she didn't touch him. She touched the fringe of his cloak, because she said to herself, if I even touch the fringe, I will be healed. Many years ago, I was so moved by this, 20 years ago, this line of scripture. I wrote a whole play, and those who are in my hymn will remember that we did a whole passion play called The Fringe of His Cloak. Now, what was this fringe of his cloak? Any Jewish person would wear a prayer shawl. I don't know whether you've seen it if ever you go to Israel. And the shawl on all four corners would have tassels, which was a reminder of God's law. And all Jews, good Jews, wear it. And she touches not even his shawl, not even him. She touches the tip of the fringe of that little tassel. You can see the great sensitivity she had in her heart of not making Jesus ritually unclear. So, what is really the might of a miracle? The might of a miracle is not that we are able to move mountains. That would be a great thing. Very often, the might of a miracle is in a very simple touch, and where humans loathe sometimes to touch others. You see it sometimes. It's even when we reach out to the poor who are dirty, the way we touch them. I remember some years ago we started a program in Lent, whereby which in our parish we would go out and feed people on the roads. And one of the things I said, if you're clicking a photograph with them, you will not click a photograph of you giving it to them. I know I broke my own rule recently, but I said, because of the pandemic I broke it. But I said to them, you will put your arm around them and click a selfie. And only if you can do that, will you click a photograph. I know in these days I would love to do it, but yes, we can't because of circumstances. So where we are often loath to touch people, Jesus sets the divine example. Even if he knew that in the sight of men, he would be rendered unclean. And Jesus takes that. He touches the girl who was dead. And he allows himself to be touched by the woman. He allows so much so, he says, power has gone through me. I can't remember that Indian artist. I think her surname is Cherry, and many years ago I saw her painting in a book where she captures this so beautifully of people pushing all around, and yet Jesus, all touching Jesus. You can imagine that crowd. And yet Jesus was aware of who wanted and desired in their hearts that healing, that miracle. And it was not even a Jew, it was a foreigner. So when we believe in Jesus, all things are possible, even the raising of the dead. The issue is our faith. And Jesus confronts us very often on this, that by virtue of our baptism, all of us have entered into this great faith of Jesus, where we should be working miracles. Now, if we don't, and by the way, I believe that we do, yeah, by love, we bring about many miracles. But even if you could not work a miracle, here's what I want to suggest. Touch people. I know you're going to say, Father, not in this pandemic, and I don't mean in this pandemic. When it's over, I think a lot of people are going to be in need of great hugs, big, strong hugs. And I wish you do this even in your home, where you know you are in a safe environment. One of the things we do in our church here is we begin our Mass with big hugs. After Mass, I stand down. I miss my hugs for 4 months now. I stand down and we shake hands and we hug each other. It's a way of expressing great love. It's a way of saying, I can embrace you if you're poor, and I can embrace the next one who's rich and embrace you if you're poor, because we are one family. We don't distinguish between this. But there are many people in this world who simply need that human touch. I don't know whether you know it. We are not touching this skin anymore. We are touching the skin of our cell phones. Some of the younger people will know that the outer covering today, the fancy outer covering of our cell phones, which is to give the phone protection and to personalize, they call it a skin. We are touching more of the skin of our gadgets than the skin of human beings. And it's time, I think, we begin to touch the real thing. Reach out and touch one another. Make this world a better place. Shake hands with one another. Hug each other. Kiss each other on the cheek, at least in your family. Don't find some neighbor's wife to do it. You'll get beaten up if you do that. But express physical love. And physical love is a beautiful thing. Physical appreciation is a beautiful thing if it's done with a pure heart. And you know, as I know, that when somebody touches you in an inappropriate manner, and I'm not talking about merely children, I'm talking about adults. Even adults. Yeah, women have that faster, quicker sense. They know when somebody is touching them in an inappropriate manner. You can make out an inappropriate touch from an appropriate touch. Don't let fear constantly keep you away from doing beautiful things. And so I want to ask you maybe today, the sign of peace, if you have your family, hug each other. Yes, I know some of you might say, I've never touched my father or hugged my mother for years. Try it today. I know they may not be comfortable with it, or you may not be comfortable, but would somebody please start, so that we bring healing and miracle, and through our touching of each other, God may wrought about miracles in our lives.